because we were so little, in terms of the community, but also because in the census data, after in 1940s and even until 1950s, most people don't answer the question where your parents were born. So you can see that even though answering that tells you a lot of what the implications were for children of immigrants back then. Okay? So we are in a new situation since 1990s and 1980s that there was a new immigrant wave in Nebraska. But in 2000s, actually, you can see that children of immigrants in the state became a larger share of the total children in the state. So in 2017, children of immigrants went 17% of the total children in the state. And 1 in 10 of the children in Nebraska is actually the child of a Latino immigrant. And something also to remind ourselves is that even though if we count by the numbers and compare the two waves, it seems that we are a smaller proportion of the larger population. Actually, I would say that is much more significant the impact of the minorities or immigrant population have in the state. And this is because, okay, sorry. What happened? Yeah, I don't know what is going on.
Moments in a trust grant.
Okay.
Let's see.
The
Bring it
next
back.
one. The next one.
There we go. That's the one, right?
Yeah, but you turned it off too. Okay. I don't know what is going on. Let's go back. Okay.
No.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So we have the median age of the non-Hispanic white population in the state is 40 years old. And the Hispanic population is 23 years old as a median age. So we have a useful age structure, if we want to use the fancy terms of demographers talk about population. But because of that useful age structure, is the reason why we're contributing more to the generational change in Nebraska. Actually, Latino births, the children of Latinos actually make 14% of the new births in Nebraska, and 18% of the children in the, actually under 5 years old in the state. Even though we have been experiencing declines in fertility, actually the general fertility of Latino women is similar to that of African Americans in Nebraska, so it's been declining. And even though we know that overall nationwide migration has slowed down, and the net migration rate for the state has also slowed down, the minority population, and particularly the Latino population, are contributing to the gains in population of the younger cohorts. Not only children, but also people at the working age. Because Nebraska keeps losing young population, particularly in the majority population, the non-Hispanic white population, keep losing population. So actually, this minority population, and particularly the immigrant population, is contributing to the numbers that we typically lose. So even accounting for the decline in fertility, for the slowdown in migration, Latinos will become inevitably, by 2050, a quarter of the population in the state. And this is just because people are coming at working age, but also reproductive age. They are making families in Nebraska, choosing to settle in Nebraska. And if we see that generational shift is already happening. The graph that I'm showing you in the next to the written part showcases one fact, Actually, the proportion of the Latino population that is 4 and more has been declining over time. We are only 35% the immigrant population. But actually, most of the population of Latinos is US born. And in 2080, actually, there was a major shift. Much more of those that were US born were born in Nebraska. So we are part of the new generation of Nebraskans Actually, I like to say Nebrasqueño because I love that to say Nebrasqueño. We are Nebrasqueños here, you know? So basically, Nebrasqueños. And if we see, I mean, I'm sorry about the graph, but this is a different graph. This is the demographers like to use, you like to use that population pyramid. And if you go up, this is the older population. You go down is the larger population. And I have separated the contribution of two sets of population, the foreign-born and the native-born. So as you can see by the graph, we have much more blue, you know, and this blue is the US-born population. And the wider bars are at the bottom. Actually, when I do this type of presentation, I ask the audience, what is your typical image of a Latino in Nebraska? Most people will tell me that is a 30-year-old man that is doing meatpacking or roofing, etc. But actually, the value that more repeats in terms of age in Nebraska is middle school kids or girls, you know? And that's the face of the Nebraska Latinos. And if we think about it, these two generations are interlinked. Actually, 75% of the population, Latino population in Nebraska, are in family households. And most of them are mixed status family households. So we have, if we think about the children, only 6.5 of them are actually even foreign-born, and 2/3 of them have either a family with two foreign-born parents, or a family that is a single parent or a two-parent household, that at least one of them is foreign-born. And this immigrant population in Nebraska, the adult population, young adult population, still is very critical to key sectors in the state. Even though over the years, the employment opportunities for Latinos in the state have been diversified, in our workforce, actually, we still have an important niche of employment in the manufacturing sector, which is meatpacking. Actually, 34% of the population still works in meatpacking industry, and 17% is in the construction sector. And we make, like in many cases, the majority of the labor force for this sector, in many small communities. So the fate of these two, we cannot think about these Latinos or immigrants without thinking about these linkages, because the fate of these two generations are intertwined. You know, the experiences of intertwined. So I want to show you some of the effects that we have been able to find in the data. These are 3 lines and come from 3 different ways to measure immigration enforcement. The black line represents that the number is a rate that I calculated based on the number of deportation orders issued by the immigrant court, prorated with the number of foreign-born non-citizen population in the state. Okay, so you can see that in the black line, the peak year has been 2010. No? If I'm correct. Okay. The second form of enforcement are detentions and arrests performed by ICE, and you know detentions. It's basically stopping people, you know, without necessarily an order or being notified, just having some suspicion, you know. Detentions can lead to arrests, and arrests can happen even without notification too. So I combined these two pieces of information, and you can see that just the year after 2011 was kind of the peak year in this line. And the third compilation is ICE removals under this program that was called the Secure Communities Program. That was in cooperation with law enforcement, and its idea was to target high crime neighborhoods or high crime communities. That was the idea behind it. And the peak year was 2013. I wanted to emphasize the years because the effect will be much more clear when you see the peaks. Mm-hmm. Most of these data are compiled in fiscal year. That means that it combines, let's say, if it's going to be for 2019, it will compile the data from the year before, starting September 1st, ending this year in October 1st. I mean, September 30 to October 1st. So the effect will be, if you have that compilation of data, the compilation in the census that typically is the mid-year will be after the fact. No? So pay attention to that. So this, you see, if we put next to this data the number of households that were run by one parent among immigrant children, you can see typically that the children of immigrants living with one parent have increased in parallel with the peak years of immigration enforcement. You know? And the effect is more dramatic if you see Hispanic children or children of Hispanic immigrants. So for instance, in the peak year of immigration court, the population living, children of immigrants, of Latino immigrants living with one parent reached 36% after the peak year in 2010. And you see that dramatically increases even with the cases of Secure Communities Program in 2013. It again started to reach up to 34% in 2015. That has also, if we go back, you see that most of this has happened before, you know, but the increase between 2016 and 2017 has had the same behavior. We have now, by 2017, 28% of children of Latino immigrants living with one parent. If we see that, well, it's almost common sense that it's hard to raise a kid when you are only one parent, you know, because of the lack of resources. And we can see the direct effect in the increases in the poverty rate. And what is interesting, you see again the same pattern of enforcement, is that if we compare what happens when the head of the household is one foreign-born parent and versus one native parent, this becomes more clear that there is a gap in the poverty rate that could be explained by all the things that we talked before, like actually Jonathan mentioned, in the difficulty of parents that are foreign-born to reach out for help because they don't want to be seen publicly and because they risk being deported themselves. So for instance, this is the native, how the native poverty rate for one-parent household have evolved. And when you see for immigrant households, the effect is even more dramatic. So even in 2006, the poverty rate for native-born parent, a native-born parent and a foreign-born parent was similar. 35%. They were equally likely to experience poverty if they were one parent-headed household. But as you can see with enforcement, the gap widens. And as I said, it is not, I don't think that it would be much of a speculation if we can attribute these differences of things that we have observed before, you know? In terms of people not reaching out for food stamps, even if they qualify. Or even certain issues, like for instance, some of the research shows that people delay critical decisions that could affect their family well-being because of the threat of deportations, like buying a house, or like expanding their businesses, etc. Anything that will imply any financial risk. And this is very clear because actually we see a slowdown in home ownership within the Latino population, and typically in Douglas County, actually, in the metro areas. And this follows the pattern of enforcement, if we can answer that question, actually. So who is deported? And the majority of cases that I have found in the data in Nebraska and this is almost something that is obvious happening in the news. The majority of cases of people being deported are people that are Mexican or the Central American origin, are men, and are people between 25 and 35 years old when these cases are recorded. That data is recorded. If we see the impact of ICE removals in the state from 2003 to 2008, and actually particularly the Secure Communities Program and this program, we see that most, the 4 in 10 cases actually were people that didn't have any conviction or have an immigration-related offense, or were a traffic-related offense, or with a traffic-related offense. And between these 57% of people that were actually have criminal charge, there are a bunch of very detailed information, I would say, and only 1 in 10 actually have assault, rape, or very serious crimes. Many of them has to do with identity theft that could be attributed by their undocumented status, or people that were driving without proof that they have the right license for the car, or kind of documentations, or were labeled as fraud or identity, fraud, etc., because they were not having paid. If we see actually the detentions in the state, border 12,000 since 2003. And most of these detentions were people that were not notified, actually 96%. And those detentions have led to arrest in most of the cases. And in the arrest, you see the same pattern happening. Not only it has increased, from 1,000 that happened before under the under the Secure Communities Program to almost 3,000 under the new ICE arrest waves. But also the emphasis have changed. Before, actually, only 1/3 of those that were targeted were living in Douglas County. Now 70% of the cases are occurring in the metro area, Douglas County. And if you follow the pattern, because typically, I know Christian will actually, I think can explain this more better even, there is a pattern: detention, arrest, some of them lead to removal, some of them appear in court. In 2018, you can see that the new filings for deportation in court, only 10% were people with criminal records. So it means that this data shows that most of the people that are actually experiencing the burden are law-abiding families. And that have experienced, I think, without, how did you say, the effect on the safety, so-called safety of our communities is really minor. And it's causing unnecessary stress to a new generation that will contribute more to the state. So I leave you.
Thank you, Lissette. So, I don't know about you guys, but when I read these kinds of stories, when I see this kind of data, the question I'm always left is, so what can we do to try to make this situation better as a society? And so, as we go through our last few slides, that's really what I want to try to focus on at various levels. From the individual on up, and maybe this can inform perhaps part of our conversation as we wrap up this talk. So I'll start with the Department of Homeland Security, and actually, Christian, do you mind passing this out for me? Thank you. I'll refer to this handout in just a moment. So the first thing I'd like to say is that these are not things that I thought of by myself or in consultation with Jonathan or with Lissette. These actually come from a report entitled Communities in Crisis, Interior Removals and the Human Consequences, which was put out last year, 2018, by the Center for Migration Studies. by Donald Kerwin and colleagues. The citation is on the bottom right on the next few slides. And if you're interested in learning more, I would direct you in that direction, because I'm just going to give some superficial points here at these various levels. But it's easy to access online. And all of these sort of issues exist at the nexus of what we can broadly talk about as homeland security issues and the humane treatment of migrants that are apprehended at the border. So some of the things that they highlight in this report is the importance of issuing guidelines that deprioritize the arrest and removal of long-term residents, of persons with U.S. Family members, and of those without criminal records or with records for only minor offenses of the sort that Lissette just highlighted. Using detention only, especially those that would involve separating kids from their families, as a last resort, or perhaps not even as a resort at all, and employ the least restrictive means necessary. This doesn't compromise homeland security. There are still ways to adjudicate all of these matters without causing the trauma and the stress that Jonathan talked about earlier in the presentation. Adhere to ICE's own national detention standards, which recognize the need for access to legal counsel. Most of the cases that have to do with deportation are adjudicated without any legal counsel. And that goes for kids as young as 4 or 5 years of age who essentially are standing before a judge and asked a series of questions of matters that really are for adults, or at least something that could be adjudicated with some proper counsel, and that provide more opportunities for family visitation to help mitigate some of that stress and trauma in these family separations. More transparency about the location of the detainees. Part of the problem is that it's unclear to family members who try to follow up to see where they can actually go to visit folks, family members that are being detained, and that information isn't readily available. In terms of issues that Congress can address, they highlight passing legislation to reduce family-based visa backlogs and to legalize the undocumented parents of U.S. citizens and undocumented persons who entered as kids, the Dreamer children that we talk about a lot. Fund the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice at appropriate levels that align with recommendations of Homeland Security experts, and reduce the use of detention and the expansion of community-based legal orientation programs. They actually go on in the report to talk a little bit about the problems that are created with the use of private detention centers and the industry that sort of sprung up to help support some of those centers as well. But the last point that I'll highlight here is providing greater oversight of the formal partnerships and collaborations between state and local police and immigration and customs enforcement to ensure that the arrangements don't undermine community safety or lead to racial profiling. Local police are not federal agents tasked with enforcing immigration laws on the books. And so those relationships need to, I think, deserve great scrutiny. And so there's some recommendations in the report about that. In terms of state and local police, I won't say too much about this. Some of these were referred to by Lissette and in other places in our presentation about making sure that there is limited collaboration between ICE and local authorities who may be acting as immigration agents. strengthening policies against racial bias in policing, adopting and implementing policies like identification cards or driver's license for the undocumented that treat immigrants, or at least allow paths or opportunities for them to become more fully incorporated as contributing members of their respective communities. A lot of people are interested in social justice issues or issues revolving around immigration with their respective faith communities. And so in this report they also have, I think, some interesting recommendations for faith communities, including addressing the urgent priorities of immigrants, the need for safe and welcoming spaces, helping with deportation planning, transportation access, help with legal representation, and accompanying them to places where they might be vulnerable to arrest, prioritizing pastoral services to immigrants and their families, educating non-immigrant members and the broader public on the immense challenges that are faced by immigrants, advocating for the generous exercise of prosecutorial discretion and humane enforcement policies that, again, don't compromise safety or security, but can prioritize family unity and the promotion of more cohesive communities. And then for individuals and families, work to raise and sustain awareness of these issues through social media by calling your congressional representatives, urging them to sponsor, to co-sponsor legislation. And there has been legislation that has addressed some of the issues that we've talked about today. I'm not going to go through these, but the handout that was provided to you just a moment ago provides a very brief overview of some of this legislation that's been passed in the last year and a half that addresses these issue of migration and keeping families together. In fact, the most recent one that I could find on congress.gov, and I recommend anyone interested in these or other issues to go to congress.gov. It's very easy to look at the legislation that's being proposed in the House and the Senate and how that relates to immigration issues or any other issue that you can think of. Was House Resolution 541. It was introduced in the 14th of January, so just a couple of weeks ago, to limit the separation of families at or near ports of entry. The summary wasn't available at congress.gov, but it should be available soon. So do take a peek at these if you're interested in those, and contact congressional representatives about them. Attend nonviolent protests in the community. Become a child advocate. I think it's actually helpful to talk to kids in developmentally appropriate ways about the issues that are being faced by families across this country at ports of entry and other places. I think it's important for those kids, and I think it's a way that, and of course this is left up to individual families, but I think it's an important aspect of socialization to make our youth aware of the issues that have to do with social justice and other issues that are going to, I think, become a more and more central part of their lives, whether it's climate change or immigration. Their generation is going to be facing a lot of these issues, and I think we can't start early enough in beginning in, again, appropriate ways for their ages to begin to make them aware of some of these issues. If you can't volunteer, donate. But what I would say most of all is be an informed voter. Pay attention to the platforms of the different parties. Pay attention to the platforms that have to do with immigration of the different candidates. and make sure that you make your voice heard. So I think we say that a lot, but the truth is that people that are eligible to vote in this country don't vote in the way that we should. It's an important right, an obligation, I believe. And if you're going to do it, you should take the time to make sure that you're an informed voter. So a lot of this, especially nowadays with the internet, you have to be careful of your sources, but there are good sources that will provide you with information in relatively straightforward ways. And so with that having been said, I'd like to go ahead and invite Christian back up. As I mentioned,